the simplest way to write is actually just to sit down and write. There's no way around that. Nothing will get written if you don't actually sit down and do it. And many people forget that. They believe that just by having all these great ideas or imagining things, that those are the things that will actually make things get written. No, if you don't write every day, if you don't, or on a regular basis, it's like trying to go to the gym once a year and thinking you're going to have a hell of a body, right? No, writing is like everything else. You have to have practice, right? But you also must understand that there are different types of writing. You know, you have different categories. You have different reasons why people are writing. Like some people want to write just because they want to have a catharsis of their experiences. And those kind of writings, there is really nothing I can really say about except just do it and write it. Nobody will see it. So don't worry about doing it right or doing it correctly or making the language sound good or anything like that. However, if your intention is that what you have written should be read by somebody and hopefully understood, maybe not just understood, but touch them in some way, that it becomes an experience. Or maybe you want to have you have a story within you that you want to share that actually could transform people's lives. Then there are certain rules about writing that you probably have to at least know before you want to break them. You know, I found many people who write and they don't want to know what the rules of writing are, or so-called elements that you need for something to work. And it turns out that they want to break rules without knowing what the rule is, and that doesn't work usually. You know, if you want to break the rule of aerodynamics for an airplane, it will just not fly. The same thing with writing. You know, in my experience, I have like it was said, I have many years of experience in this, and I just started writing for my own desire to have adventures that I couldn't have when I was a child, 12, 13, 14 years old, right? That's when I started writing. But as I started writing my novels, I realized, hey, this would be nice if somebody reads it. And then I found myself with the reality, right? First drafts usually don't work. And when people read things that are published, usually those have been revised many times, even by many people. So if you have a first draft that you don't like, that you think is like some people say the first drafts are shit, I don't agree with that, then you have to realize if it's published, it wasn't the first draft what was published. It's a lot of work gone into revising. So do not worry if the first draft doesn't sound good to you, even to you who wrote it. You know, just don't let that part of your mind interfere with saying this doesn't work. No. Writing actually for publication or for presenting to others should be actually a lot of work in revision. The question is, what are you going to revise? How are you going to revise? You know, these are all questions that people have about it. First of all, when we are writing something, we have to realize that human beings are wired for three things. They're wired for food, because without food, we as individuals or the species could not survive. So there's something in our brains that makes us go crazy if we don't have food. But not everybody can plant food or grow food. There are certain people who have that talent or that desire to do it, and they have to learn how to grow food so others can eat. It's just the same thing like for us writers. Some people like stories. Everybody has to like stories, right? But not everybody has a talent or has put the effort in to knowing how to write those stories or create those stories. The other thing is that we are wired for sex. I mean, you guys I see here are old enough to realize that sometimes we do really crazy stuff for that. We even don't want to sleep, don't want to eat. We go out of the way and do really stupid stuff sometimes because as individuals, as a species, we cannot survive. This is how hardwired we are to that as well. The third thing that few people know is that we're also wired for story. Story is what allows us as individuals to grow, to learn things, to learn what not to do. And as a species, it has been what at the campfire, the stories that were told at the campfire allowed other people who were not part of the hunt or how to grow food part of life to learn how to do it without having experienced it. Many times there are people who go out and have really difficult experiences. They come back and they share that in how they did it, how they survived it. And the people who didn't experience it actually can learn from it, even though they haven't participated in that. And this is the reason why when we see or we hear a story that is well made, we basically even forget about food or about sex. Netflix, they said a few years ago, has made that there are fewer children coming out in the world. Doesn't say what the story is the story is good or bad. Doesn't say anything about the content. It just says that some people are just glued to that because something happens in their brains that just makes them want to listen, want to see that story, want to hear it, want to read it, right? How many of you have had in life an experience where you knew the following day you had to get up early, go to work, or maybe some people had to give an exam when they were in school, and they decide to stay up and read a good novel, even though they knew that they shouldn't have done that? That's the feeling we have because we are wired for story. Now, again, if you don't cook food, or if you don't have food that is done properly, you taste it, it may not taste well, you won't want to eat it, right? So the same thing with stories. If the story is not prepared in a certain way, even though it may be a story behind it, if it's not done properly, it will just make people lose interest. And there are a few things that are needed to make that happen. And I ask myself, what are those things without which a story cannot exist? The minimum requirements for a story to exist. What are the elements that should be there? One of them is characters. If you don't have a character, there is no story. Character is what allows us to relate to something or to somebody in a specific situation. Some people might say, wait, but I'm writing nonfiction, right? I'm writing about a car. Well, the car becomes a character if you do it properly. If you follow those understandings that you have to have a certain empathy, so that's what happens. We're wired to have empathy with the characters we're reading about. If we have no empathy, it will not work. I'm not going to go into how to create characters at the moment. This is not what I'm going to be talking about today. I do have to say, though, that you must be aware that you have to know who your story is about. Or if you have, I don't know, a volcano you're talking about, that volcano becomes a character. I don't know if that is clear. I mean, if you have notes, again, just write them down. If you have questions for later, I'm willing to answer those. The second aspect or second element without which stories cannot exist is setting. It has to happen somewhere. So even if it happens within a character's mind, a character's brain, it has to be clear that that's where it's happening. But usually it's happening in a setting, right? And this is important. Sometimes when we write about something that is very highbrow, maybe, or if you write a memoir that's very personal, it's so personal to us, sometimes we forget that we have to set it somewhere. We have to locate whoever is reading or seeing the story somewhere. In film, it's a bit more simple because you have to film a setting, so it's clear where you're at. But in writing, it's not always top of mind for many. And it is really one of the hardest things to do sometimes, especially for me, to create settings that actually mean something to the story. If a story happens just in any place, the setting is not important. If the story can happen only in one place, the setting is important. And sometimes, actually, I was just asked to be part of a panel at ThrillerFest in New York this coming June 2023, where the panel discussion is setting as character, where the setting is so important, has such characteristics that it actually becomes part of the story in such a way that is considered almost a character. So you can decide, is a setting just a placing? It's just like you go walk through a street. It's not important which street it is, or is it going to happen somewhere will actually transform your characters, or is it going to be just an experience? So these are elements in setting which you must sort of ask yourself: is this a kind of a setting that is really important to the story, or is this a kind of story where I can just make it any setting? I mean, if you're writing nonfiction, it will depend on what you're writing about, right? But if you actually are able to put a setting, this happened in this time. Setting is not just a location. Setting is a place in space and time and a period. The setting is not the same thing what I said at the campfire when human beings were fighting or dealing with saber-toothed tigers as today, let's say in New York City. Different settings, different things can happen to the character, right? The third aspect without which a story cannot exist is conflict. And we forget this many times. If there is no conflict, if we just describe events that happen, characters that are well described, settings that are very nice, but there is no conflict in this, we are wired for conflict. So the paradox here is that as human beings, most of us avoid conflict as much as we can. However, if we as writers avoid conflict for our characters as much as we can, the story is dead. So the question here is, well, what is conflict? What kind of conflicts are there, right? Again, this is a workshop I've put up on Udemy. I can actually, after that, I can put a link for those who are participating in this class today. So you can actually go in for free. I'll give you that. You can go in for free to the Udemy course. It's 2 hours, 37 minutes of just conflict. What is conflict? It's so important. And it's actually one of the simplest things that we can be aware of in our story. Is there a conflict in this story? What type of conflict is it? Just to give you a very quick overview, there are 9 types of conflict. It can be physical conflict, it can be mental conflict, and it can be emotional conflict. And each of those 3 is a conflict of a character versus self, character versus character, or character versus the world. That will be at the physical, at the mental, or at the emotional level. Those 9 conflicts, in what I have discovered or seen in my research, cover all stories in the world. So you have to choose usually one of those conflicts as the main conflict, and you can actually be able to know how to close the story nicely. Again, if you have questions about this at the end, I can talk more about it. So your individual needs to understand this further, I can probably help with that a bit. The next thing I would say about story without which it cannot work is something called structure, right? Structure is something that the Greeks knew now for over 2,500 years, that there is a specific structure that appears to be ingrained in us, which allows us to understand stories better. And this has been developed more and more, especially in the last 30 years since I started writing, mostly for cinema, for films, because there, if you don't know how to grab a person, if you're going to invest $100 million into telling a story and it just doesn't work, it's not going to fly for those who put the money up for it, right? Not just for the public in general. It doesn't mean that if your structure doesn't follow certain patterns, that it's not going to work, but they found that there is a bell curve of how many people in the world will actually be able to relate to a story in relation to the anatomy of the story, in this case of the type of structure it has, and how few people will actually be happy to just hear a story about a character that almost has no setting and apparently no goals. It's just a lot of literary ramblings, which can be very nice linguistically speaking, but we do not fulfill the actual purpose of story, which is to transmit something to those who are reading it or hearing it or seeing it. So the most classical structure, and this is where if you want to make it your life simple, and if you don't want to start breaking rules before you actually know how they work, I would suggest that you start looking at this structure. It doesn't matter if it's for fiction, non-fiction, short stories. I use that structure for 30-second TV commercials. Right? How can you make a structure in half a page of a script? Well, it has to be there. People who see it or read it will not notice it. That's the thing. You're not looking at Miss Universe or Mr. Universe skeleton. You see what's around it, but behind that, there is actually a very specific kind of proportions that Leonardo da Vinci actually was trying to find. What are golden proportions of a human body? Golden proportions of a plane. If a plane doesn't have those proportions, it will not fly. Leaves have those. All the beautiful things, artwork, have those golden proportions within them. And writing has that as well in its own structure, right? So this is very important. Of course, you can become artistic about it and try to break the rules in a certain way. But if you already know how to do that, you may get away with that. Because some stories, for example, are not necessarily all about a plot, which is the main aspect of how structure works, right? For example, some stories are related to human relationships. It's not about the plot itself, it's about how relations to people happen. But even within those, there are elements of these structures that I'm going to be talking about today that will actually help you. So if you have a text, it's going to start and it's going to end. Doesn't matter how long it is. If it's half a page, if it's 400 pages, it's going to start, it's going to end. So in structure, it's about mathematics. Actually, this may seem a bit crazy. I don't know what mathematics. I'm a writer. I'll go with language. But this is how it works. I found it actually helps to make stories simple in the ways you want to create it or build it. Or if you are one of those who they call a pantser, who just sits down and just writes and writes and writes. Okay, for yourself, you're doing that. But when you want somebody to actually be able to, again, get this story bugging them, get the serotonin flowing in their brains to get grabbed by the story, you have to know that the end result has to have a certain anatomy. The story has to have proportions for it to be something that will actually be able to be understood or have people's interest. So if you have a story, let's say it's, to make it simple, let's say it's 100 pages long, right? Just as you can divide that and apply the rule of 3 if you want to this, but if you have a story that is 100 pages long, you would divide that on a piece of paper. You can just take a piece of paper and divide that into 4 sections that are of equal length. So in this case, I do that all the time. I put 100 pages and I divided the first 20 to 25 is like a pillar. There's a middle, and then there's the second pillar, basically, right? These have names, and if you know what the names are, you will remember them easier. But if you just do that for any story, okay, you say 100 pages is a bit too long for me. I want to just write something short. Okay, let's make it 4 pages. 1 page is the first quarter. Then you have the second quarter, third, and fourth. And each one of those has a function. It's like your head has a function, your torso has a function, your limbs have a function. The anatomy of story has a function. So if you have the first quarter, you put that a little line there in the first quarter, and that line is called turning point 1. They call it the point of no return. I usually give the example of the air industry, airplanes, where they call it the V1. If a plane is taking off, it accelerates, it goes to a point in the runway where it has to take off. If it doesn't take off, it can't stop, it will crash. This is a metaphoric view of if your story doesn't have the turning point 1 and the function doesn't work, that's where your story really has to take off. The character has to be in a position where it's a point of no return. Now, I have applied this to marketing as well, where the hero is not somebody in the story itself, but is the person we are actually targeting as the target for the marketing. They are the heroes. And at that point, they have to realize there's a point of no return. That's getting a bit into deeper aspect of who are you writing for. But just to give an example, it applies there as well, right? So in this point of no return is when something happens in the conflict, as I said, physical, mental, or emotional conflict, where the story in the character's eyes has made a massive shift and they cannot turn back. If that shift doesn't happen, you are going to continue with the same value as before, the same emotional value as before, right? Then the other part, the turning point 2, not the midpoint. Turning point 2 is again 3/4 of the way in. It has another function. I'm going to tell you in a moment what the function is. Again, if it's a one-page story, you divide a page into 4 parts. You say, what's the turning point in each part? And this is how you are going to make this writing simple, because you're not going to think about a whole page or 4 pages or 100 pages, or like some of the novels that I write, 400 pages long, where you realize these events are like the pillars in a tent. If they're not there, the tent lies flat. The story doesn't rise. The bread in the oven is going to go flat, basically, if you don't cook it properly, right? So you have turning point 2, which is 3/4 of the way towards the end of the story. And then you have a midpoint. The midpoint is what they call the mirror moment, where the problem or the conflict has been seen, but still not fully understood. If you're writing nonfiction, you say, okay, how can you present this mirror moment for the reader to realize, oh yeah, I know what this is all about. And it turns out that you left something in your sleeve to tell them later, to present it in turning point 2, right? But just this fact of dividing anything you're writing into 4 is going to make things so much simpler, because you know you have a goal. This is where I'm going to go to, and this is going to happen at that point. I don't know if you're writing fiction or nonfiction or memoir, but if you're writing, you have to realize that you are the creator of the story that you're putting here. You have control of what you want to say. Even if you decide to put in the turning point a flashback, right? You will be able to know that's something that you're going to pass on to the reader or the viewer, that they're going to realize, hey, this story has just taken off. Now, let's go back a bit to the beginning. The first quarter of it, the first sequence, as I call it, has a function, which is basically, it has a name. It's called the imperfect situation for your character. So your character is normal life, is what you're describing, or the situation that you are talking about in terms of a nonfiction article about, I don't know, immigrants in Canada, for example, or immigrants to Canada. You describe their daily lives, but the element of something being imperfect has to be in it. If you watch any film, if you see any story, you realize that the setting shows things that are imperfect. The character has things that are imperfect. The relationships are not perfect. And this is why in turning point 2, something happens and they cannot go back to that. They don't want to go back to this imperfection. They have gone into an imbalance that will propel them forward in the story. And we recognize that in our lives. If we're not happy with our lives, many people don't want to do anything. They prefer to go watch Netflix and they forget about the imperfection of their life, right? They're putting serotonin in their brains and they are happy and that's it. They won't change their lives, right? They won't transform as people. But we, in at least what I'm trying to do when I'm writing, is that the readers can transform their lives in one way or another. So I have to have them go through this experience. I recently wrote an article that's going to be published in the next few months in a university magazine here in Ecuador, it's a university magazine in Ecuador. And it's about breathing, right? The first part describes how people don't breathe correctly. It's something as simple as our breathing. It's another subject that nothing to do with the fictional world, but everybody in the world, or most people, are actually not breathing properly, and that's why they're not feeling good. And when they realize, hey, wait a minute, one thing that they're doing wrongly is breathing through their mouths. And if you continue with that, these are the effects that are going to happen. If you continue with that, I can talk about that another time. If you want to ask me questions about it, I can send you the article in Spanish if you want to. But this is an example of how in a piece of writing that is not a fictional piece, you can add this element of imperfection, imperfect situation. A turning point one is when the character, something happens that makes them realize that they cannot continue with this imperfect situation. They don't want to go back. They can't go back. Depending on the type of story, depending if it's a thriller, if it's a murder mystery, if it's something like that, it's going to shift depending on the type of conflict we're talking about. But in general terms, after turning point one is something that I would call the fish out of water scenario, where the character suddenly is in a new situation, where the rules are new, and they feel like a fish out of water. So, for example, in the moment that I tell you that if you're breathing through your mouth all the time, you probably have health issues with that. And I have told you this situation in the turning point one, and I then give you a few of the what they call fun and games elements in the story, where a person starts looking at what are rules of this new situation I'm in and tries to learn them. This is what we as human beings expect to have and see in stories. Oh, they went to hunt the mammoth, and then it turns out a saber-toothed tiger came. What did they do there? They were in a situation that was not known. How did they resolve that? This is ingrained in us. That's why stories appeal to us, because we're expecting this moment of, how is a character going to get out of this if they don't know what to do, right? So this is more or less goes into, if you divide it in from the turning point one, which is 25%, this goes again another 15 to 20% into the story, where another thing happens, and we go into what is called the central conflict, the actual reason why we have a story. If it's a topic about breeding and health, this is where we're going to discuss that. If it's a murder mystery, this is where the main elements of why did they do it? Why did the killer do this is coming out, the moral aspect, the message. And this is then in the midpoint where the actual theme of the story, the mirror moment, shows them this is what you're dealing with, yet they don't have the solution yet. If you put the solution there to their problem, that's the end of the story. So you have to know how to leave certain elements of, you know what the solution is to the problem. And this is the thing about writing. We are reading or we are watching stories because we want to see in the climax of the story at the end how this gets resolved. There's a joke that a writer, I forget his name, he's I think a playwright. He says that the reason why we know that a French film has ended is because we've seen the words the end at the end of the film, not because the story ended. They leave the so-called open endings, right? So what's that all about? That if we are up in our heads, we will say, okay, we can interpret it this way or that way, but A story has to be an emotional experience at the core, especially if it's fiction, right? And so when you have this mirror moment that I'm talking about, right smack in the middle of the second page if it's 4, page 50 if it's 100, or however long your story is, you give that element of, okay, this is what the central conflict is about, but you don't know the solution yet. You don't understand what you're seeing yet. And from then it sort of goes downwards in the situation where things just get worse. Okay, you had an imperfect situation in the beginning of this story, but then things go from bad to worse. You haven't recognized what the central conflict actually means to you in your life, how to solve it. So you're starting to make decisions that are wrong. What are those wrong decisions that we made in our lives? If you're writing a memoir, this is where you start putting in, okay, I didn't recognize that I shouldn't have stayed with that person, that this person was actually a clinical psychopath. I didn't want to see it. or I realized that my partner was a clinical psychopath, and it turns out that I believe that I could change the person. No, you can't change a clinical psychopath unless you know you have that information, right? So you go to this point, and then you make a decision, like from the middle of the story. I don't know which way you see it, but if this is the end, this is where in the middle, between the middle and turning point 2, something happens there where you decide, or the character decides, okay, I'm going to do this now. And that decision, because they didn't recognize the actual problem that they were having, is what leads them down to what they call the dark night of the soul, where everything is lost. You will recognize in films, in books, where you suddenly come to a point where it seems that the character, that's it. They're going to die. They're going to lose everything. Maybe they lose everything, right? And they don't know why that happened. But then a little bit of information comes in. For example, in what I said about, okay, the partner I had is a clinical psychopath. I'm going to try to change them. That's the wrong decision because you can't change them, but the person doesn't know. And then at that dark night of the soul moment, they get this snippet of information. The only thing you can do with a clinical psychopath is to keep them as far away from you as possible. How are you going to do that, right? This information, this light, as difficult as it may seem, is the purpose of turning point 2, which is 3/4 into the story, right? I had to do TV commercial or spots for Toyota for their 4x4 program. And the TV spot was about one of them, for example, about how to drive in mud. So that's where I make the car get stuck and not be able to get out. And then a little bit of information comes in. If you do this, you can get out of the mud. Or drive through sand. If you do this, you can get out of the mud. In life, depending on the conflict we're talking about, if you do this, you may be able to solve your problem. The problem will be solved if your intention for writing this story is that it's actually comes up with a happy ending, as they call it. So, okay, the character will find out how to resolve that. And if your intention is to say that character will not know or will learn too late, then it becomes a tragedy. So the big dramas of life, is it a happy ending kind of story? Is it a tragedy? We are trying to find out, how do we get out of these dark nights of the soul in our lives? And how do we apply the information that we get in this turning point 2 in our story to what they call, let's go attack the castle. So it's a long shot. Okay, how do I resolve this issue? Now I have, like I said, in the Toyota commercial about mud driving, you have this massive bit of mud. Okay, how do I do this? Okay, now I'm going to try to apply what I learned in the whole story to this situation. And if I really learned how to do it, I'm going to come out of that mud field. Otherwise, I'd be stuck there, you know, or in life as well. So these are just metaphoric examples that I actually have applied in my writing, but they're designed for you to sort of have a visual of how the anatomy of story works, right? How to make it simple. And the shorter the story it is, sometimes the harder it is, because you don't have space to develop certain things. I prefer to write novels and short stories because short stories are really, really difficult to write. Novels, you can put many things in it, and it's depending how you like to breathe, deeply or just shallowly, I would say. This is, you have to discover for yourself what's the kind of writing that applies to you. Again, so we have the turning point 2, where this snippet of information comes in, the light shines, you say, aha, this is where I'm going to go. And this is also what is called the attack on the castle part of the story, where you regroup, or the character regroups all they learned or all the friends they gained, and they make a group and they decide to go and attack the castle and see if they win, right? And this is then the moment of when you go to famous, what they call the climax. It's just at the end of the story. The climax resolution is part of the resolution of the story. The climax is basically has to have a moment where your character has a moment of self-revelation. What they did not see in the mirror moment at the center of the story, now they know what it means. What is it within them that they didn't understand, that now they are able to grasp, that allows them to take this extra leap, extra step, and win the final battle, regardless of how you envision it, as a physical battle, an emotional battle, a mental battle. And then what happens many times is that many, especially action films, that's where they end. You won the battle and that's it. Or nowadays, because we have seen so many romantic movies, we know they're going to kiss at the end. We don't show them kissing anymore. No, that doesn't work. You have to show them kissing. You have to show them in their new equilibrium. The denouement, as it's called, has to show in setting a character in their new equilibrium and how the story actually resolved. Yeah, they won the battle, but what are the effects of having won the battle at the climax? With themselves or with another character or with the world? What are those effects? And how are they happy? Are they not happy? I mean, this is the simple way of saying it. Now, the problem is that many go, oh, but it's too simple to go happy ending, sad ending. We see the stories like that. Well, there are different ways of going, of learning how to end a story properly. And that's if you know what your conflict actually was all about. If you're writing and you don't know what your conflict was all about, then you don't know how to end, because you didn't know how to resolve that conflict. The conflict you started with at the beginning has to have a resolution at the end. You may have many different conflicts throughout the story, but a story is about a conflict that has been resolved for good or for bad, for gain or for loss. Many times the hero ends up dead. It's not a sad ending, but it's not a happy one either. Why are we satisfied? So what satisfies us in stories depends on the conflict. What makes a story work depends on if we work with the structure properly and put the right things at the right time. If we put the resolution of the story in the beginning, we'll basically have no story left. I don't know if you have any questions about this. Please write them down. I'm going to just charge my computer. Realize that I left it off. Almost had a conflict with my machine here. And I know how to solve it because of prior experiences, right? So my experience in how to solve my computer problem of having no battery left has been resolved. You guys can probably learn from this if I show you that there's a thing you can put the plug in. This is how we learn as society. We build ourselves up through story. The other aspect that I find important to make writing simple is something I said in the beginning. First drafts are not shit, but they are not the finished product. First drafts have the gems of what we had inside and put on paper or put out, that when we revise, we have to go and find them, right? And then as we find them, we can also add to it. We can also bring new elements, because for many writers, writing is actually a journey of discovery, a journey of research, a journey of learning. And it's through the writing aspect that we have been learning about subjects that then we are sharing with people. Again, it depends if you're a pantser, as they call it, by seat of your pants, you just sit down and write, or if you're a plotter that knows the entire story and then just makes it work. There's a whole fight about which is the best way to go about writing. Should you just type things down and just do it? Or should you actually define what scenes or what plots or you should have? You know, for me, it doesn't matter. Different people have different ways of doing it. The thing is that at the end, you have to know that you have a structure, and that if this structure is simple, your writing will be simpler. You at least don't have to worry about, is it working at the structural level? Like I said, I have this course on Udemy about conflict. I mean, it is simple, but if it were that simple, I feel like we wouldn't want any more stories, because we know how to resolve conflicts in our lives all the time, right? And this is the power that we have. We can share with people our experiences, and if they're unique enough, people want to hear them. If they heard the story before, over and over, they may not want to hear it, unless you have done such a good job that in spite of not having any content, the story is done in such a good way that you continue watching Netflix or some other program that is like, say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, but it's well done, kind of thing, you know? When you revise, there are different ways of revising, and many times people have a problem with the revision stage, where they're trying to start revising the grammar. They start revising how the sentences are written, when in fact, if the story is not working properly, you have to first see at the macro level, is the story working properly? Am I making sense here, right? Are the right elements in the right places? Is my turning point 1, is my mirror moment, is my turning point 2 clear? The beginning, did I leave a hook at the beginning? I have a book up here among the books on writing, which is called The Hook. It's a whole book about the hook, how to hook people. What makes people want to continue reading after the first line, the first page. It is said that if you want to present manuscripts, or fiction in this case, to literary agents to see if somebody represents you, or to publishers, that if you haven't grabbed the reader in the first 13 lines, you have lost their attention. There are some agents that said, I want to see the first page and see if I want to make a decision on your book. There are some that say, I want the first 5 pages. Most say maybe the first 10 to 20 pages. How can you know if a story of 400 pages is good in the first 5 pages? Because that's where the hook is at, and that's where the elements or the mistakes that somebody can make in writing are found throughout the novel, usually. I have another book called The First 5 Pages, you know, because it's like, this is a craft as much as it's an art. And yeah, we may have inspiration, but if we don't know the craft, if we don't know about how to make it into an art as well, then people will, they like popcorn, I know, but how much popcorn can you eat before feeling bloated? Yeah, I mean, this is there's so much about writing that it can seem to be very complicated. But again, like I said in the beginning, write and just start writing and try to figure out why and who are you writing for. Is it just simply for yourself, to a moment of catharsis, of writing something down so you can bring something out and see it on a page and understand it, which is one of the functions of writing? Or are you intending to get to a bigger public, to more readers, to share something that you want to just give them an experience, you want to transform their lives? All of these are questions that some, as a writer or see people who want to write have to sort of somehow at least ask the question, even if they don't have an answer yet. The answer will come as you're doing it. I don't know if we want to open for questions now.
So Leonardo is inviting us to ask questions. Does anybody want to wave their hand and take the plunge?
Take plunge.
I'm sorry, can you tell me your name? Is it?
So I'm Lorna.
Lorna? Hi, Lorna. Go ahead.
Hi. So my plunge is, I really like the simple structure of the story. But does that mean that the story needs to be, okay, like in terms of time, it's kind of sequential? How do you turn time, like maybe you start at the end and then go back, so that it's like the conflicts at the end, so it's not sequential. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, you have to realize three things there. One of them, when we read a story or watch a story or hear a story, is sequential.
Mm-hmm.
The experience of reading or watching or hearing is sequential. You can't jump time in how people perceive the story. But when you tell the story, you can jump all over, as long as you don't confuse the people, as long as it makes sense. Everything has to have a specific reason for happening in a story. I know of, for example, the question of how do you begin? Can you begin from the end? Sort of a known writer, sort of a friend of mine to a degree, an acquaintance in the world of thrillers. I read one of his novels, and he sort of started with the hook, was part of the climax of the final battle.
Mm.
So you realize this is gonna get really, really serious. That he put in the beginning. That was a hook he used to grab people's attention. So then when things started developing, he went, okay, but all of this started here in this point. And then he went to the story. But he used that element from the end here because he didn't have a proper hook, because in the beginning, nothing was really happening yet. And he needed to grab people's attention. Now, you may be able to put in the turning point one, instead of an event that happens sequentially, the character suddenly has an effect to the life that he's leading at the moment, which is imperfect, where an event that happened years ago suddenly now makes sense. And they recognize why the grandmother did what she did. And therefore, they cannot turn back.
Yeah.
Right? So it's really up to you, but you must know that in that 20-25% mark, that's when this information comes in, basically from subtext to text, so the story cannot stay there. They cannot continue as it is. The mirror moment may be something from the past, or it can be something, if you're writing science fiction, from the future. You see, that then you can see later. However, the more you flip back and forth in time, the more difficult it is to keep readers' attention, depending on what you're doing. If it's a memoir, it's obvious. If it's a murder mystery, maybe there are elements from the past that you need to put in there, or a scene that has to come in there. You can be playing in different times, right? But that doesn't change the structure of when certain elements, these pillars in the story, have to occur. I don't know if that answers that question.
Well, thank you.
Any more questions?
Hi there. Can you identify yourself?
Yes, I'm Joseph Delcourt from France. Leonardo, thank you for what you've been giving us. I wonder something. I've read some writer criticizing the fact that books could be written at the first person. I do this and I did that and I would do that, and the whole book is at the first person. Is it something that you would not recommend or recommend? That's the first question. And the second one is quite the same, about tenses. Similar critics would be read about writing at the present tense, while most of the books are written on the past tenses. What would you say about those two ways of writing?
Yeah, your first question is a question about point of view. Whose point of view is the story about? Critics in general would actually be published writers if they knew what they were actually talking about, in most cases, I would say, or that at least that's the joke that goes around, right? They're frustrated writers who have opinions about how to do something. There are no hard and fast rules about writing. The only one, it has to work, right? So in the case of first person tense, I saw this, I saw that. I write a lot in first person. Actually, right now, I'm revising a novel in Spanish from a publisher here. I'm going to deliver it next week. And it is all in first person. But Leonardo Wild is a character in that book. So is the other guy, the main character is narrating it as I, even though I appear as some other character there, which is for me quite hard to do because this guy's arguing against me sometimes, right? Who's writing it? So it's kind of a thing. But so the reason why you put first tense and what are the limitations of first tense, right? Like everything, first tense is something very personal. If you're writing a memoir about your life, it would be silly not to write it first person. He did that. It would be actually very, very, very strange, right? I have also in novels mixed first person and third person. So who is the main character is first person, and usually in first person it's very intimate, and at the same time, however, it limits you how much your character knows about something. And many times the good thing about first person is they may believe that something is a way and it turns out to be totally opposite. So playing with this first person limitation gives you the strength of not saying certain things that you don't want the reader to know. So there is no thing about first person doesn't work or not. I combine first person, third person. Second person, you. I did a nonfiction book. Actually, I did a nonfiction book in first person plural. We are all in this. So if I would say it as me, then that wasn't true. But if say I included everybody who's reading in this nonfiction book on money, on monetary engineering. So you have to see what is the reason for applying third person. Now, third person gives you a certain distance and it becomes more objective, right? Then you have another element of point of view. Is it omniscient or is it limited? So it's quite a complex part, but to answer your first question, there is no hard and fast rule that says first person doesn't work. Actually, sometimes it's the only way of it working. In the other thing, past or present, screenplays are written in the first in the present tense. This is happening because you are watching it. But usually, if you're reading it it's happening now in In fiction, actually, it can be quite awkward if you don't know how to do it well, and you have less chances in the language to use past tense as well, right? But you must realize that, for example, what I do, and this is the mind-bending aspect of it, of what is first person, what isn't. The story may be in the past, but when somebody is speaking, they're speaking in the present. But we don't see that. Our brains just manage to just bring all this like in a dream. I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah, Sushil.
I think Joseph wants.
Yeah, Leonardo, in the beginning,
We'll go back to you, Joseph. Go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
So in the beginning, you talked about a setting having so much, giving so much to a setting that it almost becomes like a character. Can you give an example about this? Because the only example I can think of is maybe Hogwarts, like a place that has so much into it that it almost becomes a character. Like, can you give another example, maybe?
Yeah, I can only give examples sometimes because I know that I did it from things that I wrote myself. It's not in any way something to start pushing books to you or something. But I know, for example, I have a thriller, a scientific thriller called Cotopaxi Alerta Roja, Cotopaxi Red Alert. This is about the volcano Cotopaxi, which is the highest single standing, historically active volcano in the world. It only is in one location and one setting, which is here in Ecuador, 40 kilometers down south from here. The setting is important there because the character, one of the characters basically is this volcano, that it threatens to awaken, and it could be, it could cause the world record in deaths. And the way the politicians deal with it, the way the people deal with it, could only happen here. It wouldn't happen in the States like that. Hopefully not. Or Japan. You have Mount Fuji there. I believe if that thing goes, they just evacuate. There's no way you're going to evacuate people here. The sad thing is this is happening now. I wrote this in 2006, and now people are reading about it and seeing it in real life, how this volcano is threatening to awaken, and they're not doing anything. They won't be able to do anything. So in that sense, this setting could only happen here. That situation. That's one example. Or another example is for if you are going to have a story in a submarine at sea in a Cold War scenario, Hunt for Red October, the setting is the character. That only works in that setting, in that situation. And that's where you can add much more details to the setting, to the submarine, to how that world works, than if you would just say, okay, I have the Hunt for Red October happen in New York in a bar. It's not going to work. So I don't know if that gives you an example of how extreme setting can actually be this story.
Thanks, Leonardo. I think, Joseph, you wanted to ask another question, didn't you?
Yeah, I was wondering about the conflict thing. You said that, well, we were hooked by conflicts, and I was wondering, it seems that some movies or books even work well with mystery. When something is mysterious and it could be even thrilling, you know, whether they will solve this mystery or not. And there is no, I think, elements of conflict in this mystery solving. I was thinking, for instance, of 2001 Space Odyssey, but I realized that at the end, of course, there was a conflict between Hal and the astronaut. So, but at the beginning, there was not something like that. It was just a mystery of this big, you know, thing coming in and bringing knowledge to the first human beings on Earth. So I was wondering whether conflict was a kind of mandatory, or there was some kind of way around conflicts to make a good story.
There is no story without conflict. Period. It's an anecdote. If you say that this thing came in out of space and there appears to be no conflict, sorry, the fact that something happens out of the ordinary, that thing came in, that's a conflict for the species that are there. We may not recognize it as a physical conflict of a character against a character, like at the end against HAL 9000. Conflict isn't just a physical thing. I say you have 3 types of conflict: physical, mental, emotional. A love story is a conflict story, usually where the antagonist and the protagonist are the two that come together at the end or not. They are the 2 main characters. One of them is the protagonist or the antagonist, and they can't come together in the beginning because that would be the end of the story, right? So by definition, love story, the conflict is an emotional conflict of a character against a character. Of course, you have other kind of emotional conflicts that are not love stories. Buddy love, they call it, or people, friends are together and then they separate because they fell out, and then they how can I say that? They learn that as friends they have to live as friends or enemies forever. That's a tragedy in that kind of a story. But basically, conflict is what drives the story. Conflict happens when a character has a desire to do something and there are obstacles in the story. That's a conflict. It can be very simple, right? But if you don't have that, if the character has no desire, no goal, there is no story. It's boring.
So in a way, it's like a challenge or something to overcome. There's
the nature of the character's desire to do something, the action to do something, and having something come in the way of that creates a conflict.
right.
If it's, I want to go and climb the mountain, that's my desire. So the desire of the character has to be clear. The character wants to do something, and then obstacles come in there, and those create the conflict. Can be physical, can be mental, oh, I can't do it, or whatever, you know. So it's actually at the core of it. And this is why I say in my Udemy course, it's one of the simplest way to make sure that the story works is to understand conflict. Understand that in every page there has to be some conflict. What you were saying, Joseph, about mystery, that's another element. The mystery is the suspense, creates tension. It creates the questions in our brain. But the character says, oh, if it's a mystery, they want to know the solution to the mystery. So that's the conflict. How they go over the obstacles to resolve that, right?
Any other questions? Well, I have a question I'd like to offer, if I could. And this has to do with identification. The books that I found most engrossing in my life, I'd have to say, are they were called the Hardy Boys books. And these were ones I read as a 10-year-old. And these were written in the third person about these brothers having adventures and so on. But what I found engrossing was the way I could identify with these. They were older boys, but they were going through, and they were and in the third person, they were describing how they dealt with a little situation, how they dealt with an authority figure, how they talked to a girl, things which as a 10-year-old I was not consciously aware of, but I was fascinated by these things. So the book sort of gave me a point of view of how you did this, how you could and how you could do it successfully. You know, so I was living, I guess, vicariously through this. So I think identification is a key element that makes a story work. On some level, the reader has to be able to identify with what's going on.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons why they say that to make writing simple, going back to the subject, you have to realize who the protagonist is, who is the main person that the reader will identify with and feel empathy for, and through whose eyes they're gonna be able to live the story. Now, there may be other characters that come that you jump to the other characters in the third person, but those are not, you can identify to a degree with them, but you're basically always keeping the main character here. Oh, this person knows this, and I know now what the person doesn't know, but this is the kind of the way the tension comes in, the suspense, the subtext. This is another element that is needed for a story to work? What's the subtext here? How to state the unstated. Another course I gave in the States years ago, and I'm going to give a workshop on that too one day, how to create subtext, right? But the reason is how to make characters likable, or how to make characters relatable. And this is one of the most difficult things to do, right? So what is it that attracts us to want to invest in being in somebody else's shoes or skin or head or mind or emotions? There may be characters that are quite unlikable, bad characters, but what makes them likable? What attracts us? We are trying to understand psychology. We're trying to understand the emotions of people. That is really at the core of fiction. Non-fiction, you may have an understanding at the mental level of things that we want to understand or know, but fiction is basically the stories that deal with our intention to understand people's behavior through emotion. So the more you're able to grasp those details, the more you're able to give those common elements that allow me to relate, to identify with the main character, with other characters, the closer I can be to not sleeping at night and wanting to stay up till dawn reading it, which is the intention that the writer has, right?
Okay, thanks, Leonardo. I see Raymond. Thank you very much for raising your hand in Zoom. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Leonard, for an excellent presentation. I'm very intrigued and probably could discuss many things for many hours. I have two questions, a simple one and a more interesting one maybe for you. So firstly, I'm just curious, on the scale of pantsers and plotters, where do you lie?
I have my own method.
What's that?
I realize that, I mean, this is a really good question, and it is not the simple one.
I thought this was a simple question. Okay.
No, that's not the simple question, because it entails an understanding of how do we work as writers in our own writing, which is really one of the keys. And sometimes it depends on what story you're writing. If you know a lot about the subject, if you know about how to structure, if you have it in you how to write the story, you can go pantsing and it's going to be no problem. The question is, are you going to be able to repeat that? For somebody who just wants to write a memoir, it's not a problem. However, if you want to make a profession out of it, it can become a problem unless you have other methods. Why do pantsers say that there's only pantsing that works in writing? Which I have a good friend who claims that, and is actually, that's his religion almost, right? It's because we are aware of only 4% of what's happening. We're conscious of 4% of what's happening around us. And most of the story comes from the subconscious. So they argue that if you are going to plot everything out, you're not leaving room for the subconscious to bring the story out. So I fully agree with pantsers in that regard. On the other hand, plotters say, how can I devote myself to a story that I don't know how it's going to end, how I'm going to finish it? How can I put something here if I don't know how to do that? And they're right as well. The end product, like I said, is one thing, and the way you do it is a different thing. What I find is that if you're very proficient with language, you're very proficient with being able to fluently be able to come up with something, pantsing is maybe not a big problem, because you don't have to think about the other elements of writing that you're working with. Einstein said, you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that caused it. So if you're thinking about grammar, if you're thinking about sentence length, if you're thinking about other aspects that, for example, a plotter wants to have control over, then they have to know what the story is about in order to focus on those things. For example, Jeffrey Deaver. I've not heard of the author Jeffrey Deaver. He's a thriller writer. He, I think, wrote they made a film with Denzel Washington, The Bone Collector, right? He's a total plotter. He researches his subjects and plots the whole thing for 6 to 8 months, has everything clear, and then writes it. On the other hand, Stephen James, another friend of mine, he doesn't plot anything. He has written a book about how you cannot plot anything about, you know. What I do is basically, I know the power of the subconscious to bring the story out, but I also know that there are limitations in understanding all these elements. I'm talking about structure and subtext and other things. So what I do is I do this thing, or I know that I have a book that's going to be 60,000 pages or 80,000, 90,000 pages long, and that I have to have these plot points. This is in writing novels. In writing screenplays, you cannot go pantsing about, or you can, but then it's going to be a lot of more work because you're going to throw out most of the stuff out anyway. And if you're going by a deadline, you just can't do it easily, unless you're such a professional or a genius that you just go ahead and do it. But most people can't, right? But in novels, what I do is then I say, okay, this is what a story, this is the conflict that I'm going to have. The novel I'm working on now is what I call, in my own words, the world of stupid. Is a mental conflict of a card against the world. It's a bureaucratic thriller where all the people believe this guy is stupid for trying to attack bureaucracy, but he actually is doing it. They also call it fool triumphant. Forrest Gump is an example of that kind of story, right? So I know my conflict. I know that I have to resolve it at that mental level. I know what the elements are. I know that I have to have certain turning points. So I write, okay, so turning point 1, this is what's going to happen in turning point 1 because of blah, 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 blah. And then next day I come and say, no, in turning point 1, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write this story like a pantser, but I'm not actually writing the actual text itself. So I'm using the power of the subconscious to write what I want to write about at the same time that I'm preparing for the plotting. One of the other arguments that others have, for example, Lee Child. Have you heard of Lee Child, the author of the Jack Reacher series? He also is a pantser. He just sits down and he writes the first chapter, and then the following day he goes, reads, revises the first, and then goes to the second chapter. He's told me that himself. You know, he was telling me that at ThrillerFest. And then he does that, and he takes a whole year to basically write a novel, right? But he said if he would know how his story ends, if he would plot it, he would be so bored he wouldn't write it, because he's trying to discover how to end the story, right? So it depends on how you do it. A friend of mine, I think he passed away already. He was a translator from Spanish to Portuguese of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Cortázar, and other very well-known authors. And I wrote an article about him and his way of translating. And he said if he would read the book and then translate it, he would be bored with the book and not translate it. So he was actually translating it as he was reading it, and that kept his interest in the book, and that's how he could finish the translations. So it really depends on what your mind is. There's no right or wrong. In my case, depending on the book, I know the turning points, the main structure, and just write. What I do now too is I have an Excel spreadsheet, where I write down, okay, it's going to be 60 pages long, and I write down the number of words that I have in the chapter and see how far am I from turning point 1, midpoint. Said, I got to wrap this up now or something. So otherwise, I'm going to have to do a lot of revising to be able to cut stuff out that I shouldn't have gone anyway, you know? So different ways of doing it.
Okay, that's great, Leonardo. That's extremely helpful. Thank you.
The second question?
You said you find setting is difficult for you. And you describe setting as a character. So do you get into situations where you've got a story developing and then you realize you really haven't got the setting worked out well? And what do you then do? How do you approach that to make it integral to the story?
Well, it doesn't have to be integral to the story. There are settings that are integral to the story, but there are others where you just have passed it. What's the function of the setting? Sometimes you're just walking, you're in a bus, and the bus takes you from A to B. Or you go on a plane. The plane is not the setting. You still describe the plane, you're in a plane, you go from A to B, and that's it. But maybe the story is about a plane that's going to crash. Then the plane becomes part of the setting that is a character. So it depends on the function. What I was saying, it's hard for me in terms of describing it. How do you describe even characters? How do you describe a character without giving a whole page or whatever that will not really actually do the description justice, because everybody imagines something differently. So how far do you go in describing things? And that, I believe, has a lot to do also with subtext. So, for example, I'm going to give an example, a subtext example. I'm going to describe a hand. It's a very thin hand where the skin is almost transparent. It's very bony. It's almost shriveled up. And it's almost like crooked like that. Whose hand is it? What do you think? People will say it's an older lady or something like that, right? So just by describing the hand, you can see the rest of the body. That's called subtext. Micro detailing can create subtext because you fill in the picture. But then I go and say, and this is a 6 foot tall, muscly guy who has that hand. What happens there? Say, wait a minute, those two don't match. And that creates tension. And that creates, wait, what happened, right? The mystery that Joseph was asking about. So how do you do that in descriptions? This is why it's hard, because, yeah, you can go ahead and describe and just make something boring, but if there is no tension, no conflict in it, if you know that that's what you have to have, how do you bring conflict and tension into everything you're doing, especially if you're writing thrillers?
Sushil, please go ahead.
Leonardo, you spoke briefly about the hook. So, what do you think is the best way I can hook someone within 13 lines, like you said? Like, any tip?
There is John Truby in his book Anatomy of Story says that the first sentence or the first scene has to be like a fractal image of the entire story that comes. You want to go down that path, right? Or you want to go the simple path, just make a description and create certain tension. The problem with the hooks is that if you have to sort of give the essence of what the whole story is going to be about without revealing anything and creating questions. I forget exactly the wording of 1984 by George Orwell, but he said something along the lines of it, something about describing a thing where the clock struck 13. Wait a minute, clocks don't strike 13, right, necessarily. Or you have Charles Dickens' famous sentence, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. He puts opposites. He creates tension. That's an example of how you can create a hook, right? But it has to be related to what the book is. It has to give you the feeling of what the book is about, right? So the main thing I would leave is that create something that will immediately attract somebody's attention and make them ask the question, how is that possible, or why? Or why do I care about this? You know, but the mind is actually really curious. If something falls out of the ordinary, we are bound to try to look at it because that could be a snake that bites us. That's how we're wired for story. The openings are classical. I mean, it's not simple to do it well. I started a novel that I wrote called An Emotion with. You got a D in emotions. That's the first line. So how is that possible, right? And that describes the book is an emotion is artificial self, a novel about the future of emotions. So that's the first line of that. So you have an image of, wait a minute, something doesn't relate to the world I know. And that's how you hook people.
So folks, a round of applause for our presenter, if you can.
Okay, thanks. Great.
Thank you very much.
That was very
Thank you,
interesting.
Leonardo.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a good
Thank you,
day.
Andrew.